The steak was seasoned with rosemary and arrogance. I watched Leo, my new wife's 19-year-old son, slice into his filet mignon with the precision of someone who had never actually worked for the meal on his plate. Across the table, Paige was glowing, her silk blouse catching the light of the chandelier I'd installed 3 months ago. Beside her sat her brother Marcus and two of their social circle's mainstays, all of them sipping a vintage red that cost more than my first car's transmission. The occasion was supposedly a celebration of new beginnings. 6 months of marriage, a blended family, and my latest gesture of goodwill. A $60,000 pickup truck currently sitting in the driveway with a bow on the hood. I had spent my career as a civil engineer calculating loads, stresses, and the integrity of foundations. I thought I was building a foundation here. I was wrong. I was just providing the materials for them to burn. Leo stood up, his glass raised. He looked at me, his eyes bright with a look I had misidentified as gratitude for weeks. It wasn't gratitude. It was the look a predator gives a particularly slow-moving target. "I want to make a statement," Leo said, his voice projecting across the silent room. "To my fake dad for the truck. Thanks for trying so hard. It's a great lesson for everyone here. You can't actually buy respect, but you can certainly lease it for $60,000. To the man who thinks a checkbook makes him a father." He drank. He didn't just sip, he drained the glass while looking me directly in the eye. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable for them. It was expectant. I looked at Marcus, who was stifling a grin behind his napkin. I looked at the neighbors, who suddenly found their silverware fascinating. Finally, I looked at Paige. She wasn't horrified. She wasn't even surprised. She reached out and patted Leo's hand, then turned to me with a smile that was as thin as a razor blade. "Oh, Trevor, don't look like that," she said, her voice airy and dismissive. "He's just being a 19-year-old. It was a joke, a bit of edgy humor to lighten the mood. Don't be so sensitive." "A joke," I repeated. My voice was calm. "In my line of work, if a bridge starts to groan, you don't panic. You look for the fracture. I had just found it." "Total joke, man," Marcus added, leaning back. "The truck is amazing. He's just saying we all know the score. No need to get your tie in a knot." I didn't respond. I didn't yell. I didn't push my chair back with a dramatic scrape. I simply set my fork down, aligning it perfectly parallel to my knife. The structural integrity of my marriage had just hit zero. The load-bearing walls were gone. Everything from this moment forward was just gravity taking its course. "I understand," I said. I stood up, walked to the hallway, and grabbed my jacket. I could hear them behind me. They weren't whispering, they were laughing. Leo said something about how the ATM was malfunctioning, followed by a chorus of hushed chuckles. I walked out the front door into the cool evening air. The truck sat in the driveway, its chrome grille shimmering under the streetlights. It was a beautiful machine, heavy, reliable, and entirely in my name. I climbed into my own SUV, parked on the curb, and pulled out my phone. The first call was to the specialized recovery service I had used for equipment transport in the past. "This is Trevor Vance," I said, my voice steady. "I have a vehicle at my primary residence. I need it moved to the secure lot in the industrial district immediately. A key is in the magnetic box under the left wheel well. Documentation is on file. Do it now." On it, Mr. Vance. We have a flatbed 10 minutes out." The second task was digital. I opened my banking app. Paige and I had a joint account for household expenses, an account I had seeded with a significant portion of my quarterly bonus. I moved every cent back into my private holdings. Then I deactivated the secondary cards. I did the same for the gas cards I'd given Leo and the emergency credit line Marcus had convinced me to co-sign for his failing landscaping business. By the time I reached the hotel 3 miles away, the digital tethers that bound my resources to their lives had been severed. I sat in the hotel room, the beige walls a stark contrast to the custom-painted crown molding of the house I had paid for. I didn't feel hurt. I felt focused. As an engineer, you learn that when a structure is compromised beyond repair, you don't try to patch it. You perform a controlled demolition so you can clear the site and start over. My phone began to vibrate on the nightstand. "Paige." I let it ring. Then came the text. "Where did you go?" "The truck is gone. Leo went out to show his friends, and the driveway is empty. Did you have it moved for a joke?" "This isn't funny, Trevor." I didn't reply. 5 minutes later, Marcus called. Then Leo. I watched the screen light up over and over again, a rhythmic pulsing of frantic energy. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about the hardware. I spent the next 4 hours on my laptop. I had been observant over the last few months, even when I was playing the role of the doting husband. I had noticed the way Paige hid her tablet when I entered the room. I had noticed the invoices for marketing that Marcus sent to our joint email, which looked suspiciously like personal debt payments. I had seen the way Leo spoke to his friends when he thought I was out of earshot. I had been collecting data without even realizing I was building a dossier. Around 2 a.m., a new message arrived from Paige. The tone had shifted from confusion to indignation. "You are being childish. You can't just take back a gift because your feelings were bruised. Everyone thinks you're being a recluse. Bring the truck back and come home so we can talk about this like adults." I typed my first and only response of the night. "The logistics have changed. Check the accounts." The reaction was instantaneous. My phone practically jumped off the table with the influx of notifications. Alerts for declined transactions began to roll in. Leo trying to buy gas, Marcus trying to pay a late bill, Paige trying to order a rideshare. The sound of my phone vibrating was the sound of their reality collapsing. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. I thought back to the dinner. I realized Leo's toast hadn't been an outburst. It had been a performance. The way Marcus had his phone angled, the way the neighbors had waited for the punchline. It was choreographed. They had practiced that moment. They had decided together that I was the source of funding, not a member of the family. They thought I was a stable, predictable bridge they could walk all over. But bridges are designed to handle specific stresses. When you exceed the limit, the collapse isn't a joke. It's a physical certainty. I pulled up a folder on my cloud drive labeled Project Site B. Inside were scanned copies of Paige's real estate filings from the last quarter. I had noticed some discrepancies in her commissions, small amounts diverted to an account I didn't recognize. At the time, I'd ignored it, wanting to trust her. Now, I looked at it with the eyes of a forensic auditor. She wasn't just dismissive of me, she was actively insulating herself, using my reputation as a shield. She was using my professional standing in the city to secure listings she wouldn't have otherwise touched. I went to the hotel desk and asked for a notepad. I began to map it out. Column A, the betrayers. Paige, Leo, Marcus. Column B, the assets. The house, the reputation, the professional standing, the social capital. Column C, the leverage. This wouldn't be about shouting matches. It wouldn't be about messy public scenes. It would be about the systematic removal of every support beam they relied on. They liked the fake dad with the deep pockets. Fine. They could see how the real version of me operated when the contract was breached. I thought about Leo's face when he realized the truck was gone. He'd probably been planning to drive it to his friend's house to brag. He'd probably told them all how he had me wrapped around his finger. I checked my email, a notification from the recovery service. Vehicle secured in Lot 4. GPS tracker active. Doors locked. I felt a cold, sharp sense of clarity. For years, I had built things meant to last. I had designed bypasses, overpasses, and structural reinforcements. I knew exactly how much pressure a system could take before it gave way. The dinner had been the inciting incident, but as I sat in the quiet of the hotel room, I realized the disrespect had been a slow-moving tide for months. Every time Paige rolled her eyes when I talked about my day, every time Marcus borrowed tools and never returned them, every time Leo treated my home like a hotel he was being paid to stay in, I had been the architect of my own humiliation by allowing it to continue. That ended tonight. I picked up my phone one last time and blocked their numbers. I didn't need to hear their excuses or their threats. I needed sleep. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of liquidating the life they thought they had secured. As I laid down, I thought about Leo's toast. To the man who thinks a checkbook makes him a father. He was right about one thing. The checkbook was closed, but he was wrong about the rest. I wasn't his father, and I wasn't his friend. I was the man who owned the ground he was standing on, and I was about to start digging. The morning light in the hotel room was sterile and unyielding, much like my current state of mind. I had slept for exactly 5 hours, the restorative minimum required for high-level cognitive function. In my profession, fatigue leads to miscalculations, and miscalculations lead to catastrophic failure. I sat at the small desk, the generic stationery now filled with a meticulously drafted map of relationships and financial dependencies. I wasn't just looking at people, I was looking at a network of parasites that had mistaken my quiet nature for a lack of awareness. By 8:00 a.m., the first stage of the aftermath began to manifest. I unlocked my phone for a brief moment to check the notifications. There were 36 missed calls from Paige, 12 from Marcus, and a string of increasingly frantic messages from Leo. The shift in tone was remarkable. The evening had begun with mockery and ended with a realization of vulnerability. The fake dad was now the only person who could restore their access to the lifestyle they considered a birthright. I spent the next 2 hours on the phone with my attorney, a man named Henderson, who specialized in asset protection and contract law. I had retained him years ago for my firm, and he understood the value of precise, unemotional action. I instructed him to begin the process of legal separation and to file a formal notice regarding the residence. Since the house was an inheritance from my grandfather, held in a premarital trust, Paige's claim to it was legally thin, though she certainly didn't know that yet. I also directed him to send a formal demand to Marcus for the return of the co-signed equipment or the immediate settlement of the outstanding balance. "You're moving fast, Trevor," Henderson remarked, his voice crackling with a hint of professional respect. "The structure has failed," I replied, staring out at the city skyline. "There is no point in waiting for the rubble to settle. I want the locks changed by noon. I've already arranged for a private security firm to monitor the perimeter. If they want their personal belongings, they can schedule a supervised time to retrieve them." After hanging up, I headed to a local coffee shop, one far enough from my usual haunts to avoid accidental encounters. I needed to observe the social ripple effects. Paige was a woman who lived for optics. To her, a dinner party wasn't a meal. It was a theater production designed to solidify her status as the matriarch of a successful, modern family. By walking out and cutting the funding, I hadn't just taken her money, I had ruined the ending of her play. I opened a secondary social media account I used for monitoring industry trends. As I expected, the whispers had already started. A mutual friend had posted a vague update about unexpected changes and supporting those in need. I saw Marcus had liked the post. They were already trying to frame me as the volatile one, the man who snapped over a harmless joke. It was a classic move. Characterize the victim's reaction as the actual problem. Around 11 a.m., I received an email from a former friend named Julian. Julian was a man I had known since college, a fellow engineer who had recently transitioned into land development. He had been at the dinner, he had been one of the people laughing. "Trevor, man, that was a heavy exit last night. I think you might have overreacted a bit. Leo is a kid, you know? He's got a big mouth, but he doesn't mean anything by it. Paige is a mess today. Why don't you come by the office and let's grab lunch? We can talk about that municipal contract and smooth things over." I stared at the screen. I thought back to the dinner, specifically the moment Leo had made his toast. I remembered seeing Julian lean over to Marcus and whisper something just before Leo stood up. I remembered the smirk on Julian's face. He wasn't a bystander. He was an architect of the moment. He wanted me distracted, perhaps even ousted from our shared professional circles, so he could claim a larger share of the upcoming infrastructure projects we were both bidding on. The realization was like a clean break in a piece of timber. I didn't feel anger. I felt the satisfaction of a puzzle piece clicking into place. Julian wasn't just a bad friend. He was a competitor who had weaponized my domestic situation to undermine my professional focus. I replied with a short, professional note. "I'm busy with logistics today, Julian. We'll discuss the contract at the formal board meeting on Friday." I spent the afternoon at a local park, sitting on a bench with my laptop. I watched families walk by, oblivious to the calculated destruction I was overseeing. I was working on the second phase of my plan, the social isolation of the betrayers. Paige relied heavily on her reputation as a top-tier real estate agent. Her success was built on the perception of stability and her connection to my professional network. I began by contacting several of my colleagues who had been considering listing their properties with her. "I'm calling to let you know that I've stepped back from the joint ventures I was managing with Paige," I told a prominent developer. "Due to some internal restructuring, I can no longer personally vouch for the administrative handling of those accounts. I'd recommend looking into a larger firm for your upcoming project." I wasn't lying. I was simply withdrawing my endorsement. In our world, an endorsement is the currency of the realm. Without it, Paige wasn't a power player. She was just another agent in an oversaturated market. As the sun began to set, I decided it was time for a more direct confrontation. I knew Leo's routine. Every Tuesday afternoon, he went to a high-end gym located in a parking structure downtown, a membership I had been paying for. I drove there and waited. I saw him pull up in his friend's beaten-up sedan. He looked miserable. Gone was the swaggering prince of the dinner table. He looked like a boy who had just realized his credit card didn't work at the drive-thru. He stepped out of the car, complaining loudly to his friend about the psycho who stole his truck. I stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. Leo froze. His friend, sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, stayed by the car. "Trevor," Leo said, his voice trying and failing to regain its edge. "Where's my truck, man? You can't just steal a gift. That's a crime." I walked toward him, my steps measured. I am not a small man, and while I rarely use my size as a tool, I knew how to occupy space. I stopped 2 feet from him. He had to look up to meet my eyes. "The truck is in a secure location, Leo," I said, my voice low and devoid of emotion. "It wasn't a gift. It was a conditional asset. You broke the conditions of the contract the moment you decided to use it as a platform for disrespect. It was a joke, he snapped, though he stepped back, his heel catching on a speed bump. Everyone said so, even Mom. You're just being a sensitive jerk because I called you out for what you are. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my hand. I simply leaned in closer. What I am, Leo, is the person who pays for your gym membership, your phone plan, your car insurance, and the roof over your mother's head. Or rather, I was that person. As of 10 o'clock this morning, you are an unemployed 19-year-old with no transport and a very expensive taste in protein powder. How does the joke feel now? He opened his mouth to retort, but the words died in his throat. He looked at his friend, looking for backup, but the other boy was staring at the ground. I want my stuff, Leo muttered, his bravado crumbling. You can collect your belongings on Thursday at 4 o'clock, I said. A security guard will escort you. If you or your Uncle Marcus set foot on the property before then, I'll have you removed for trespassing. Do you understand? Leo tried to scoff, but it came out as a shaky breath. You're crazy. Mom's going to take you for everything. She's welcome to try, I said, but she'll find that the foundation of her everything was built on my credit, and I've just revoked the permit. I turned and walked away. I could hear him yelling something behind me, a string of insults that lacked any real weight. He was a child throwing a tantrum because the world had stopped catering to him. I returned to my car and sat in the silence. The encounter had confirmed my suspicions. They didn't feel remorse. They felt inconvenienced. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a utility. And you don't argue with a utility. You either pay the bill or you sit in the dark. I drove toward the outskirts of the city, toward a small construction site I had been consulting on. I needed to clear my head with something tangible, steel, concrete, and physics. But as I drove, I saw a familiar car parked outside a high-end restaurant. It was Julian's luxury sedan, and sitting in the passenger seat was Paige. I pulled into a nearby lot and watched. They weren't fighting. They weren't looking for me. They were talking intensely, Paige gesturing with her phone while Julian nodded, a hand on her shoulder in a gesture that was far too familiar to be just friends. The rehook was instantaneous. The dinner wasn't just a moment of disrespect, it was a transition. They were already moving on to the next source of funding. They had probably been planning this for weeks, waiting for the right moment to push me out so they could consolidate their interests. I took a photo of the car and the two of them through the restaurant window. It wasn't for a divorce court. I didn't need it for that. It was for the board meeting on Friday. Julian wanted to talk about the municipal contract. We would talk about it. We would talk about his ethics, his associations, and his tendency to interfere in the domestic lives of his partners. I felt a surge of cold, focused energy. The betrayal was deeper than I had imagined, which meant the reckoning had to be more comprehensive. They weren't just parasites, they were saboteurs. I started the engine and drove back toward the hotel. I had work to do. I needed to look into Marcus's business filings. If he was using my name to secure loans, I needed to ensure those lenders knew the association was terminated. I needed to look into Paige's recent listings and see how many of them were built on the backs of my professional favors. As I pulled into the hotel parking lot, I saw a black SUV parked near the entrance. Marcus was leaning against the hood, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked like he was waiting for a fight. I parked my car and stepped out. I didn't reach for a weapon or a phone. I just stood there, waiting. "You think you're pretty smart, don't you, Trevor?" Marcus called out, his voice echoing in the nearly empty lot. "Cutting everyone off, taking the truck. You're going to regret making this personal." "It was already personal, Marcus," I said, walking toward the entrance. "I'm just making it official." He stepped in my way, his face red with a combination of anger and what I suspected was a few drinks. "You owe us, for everything Paige did for you, for being a family." "I don't owe you anything but the truth," I said, stopping inches from him. "And the truth is, your business is a shell, your nephew is a failure, and your sister is looking for a new benefactor. You have until tomorrow to return my tools, or I'm filing a police report for theft. Move." He hesitated, his eyes darting around. He wasn't a brave man. He was a bully who had lost his leverage. He stepped aside, muttering a threat I didn't bother to record. I walked into the lobby, the automatic doors closing behind me with a soft, final hiss. The first act was over. The boundaries had been set. Now, the real work of dismantling their world would begin. The following morning, I operated with the quiet efficiency of a machine. My hotel room had become a command center, the desk covered in site maps, contractual agreements, and financial ledgers. In civil engineering, there is a concept known as scour, the erosion of soil around a structure's foundation due to the flow of water. If left unchecked, scour can cause even the most massive bridge to tilt and eventually collapse. Paige, Marcus, and Julian had been the rushing water, slowly eating away at my foundation while I wasn't looking. Now I was redirecting the flow. I spent the early hours reviewing the blueprints for the upcoming Riverside development project. This was the municipal contract Julian had mentioned in his email, the one he was desperate to secure. As the lead consultant for the city's infrastructure committee, my firm held the power of technical approval. If the engineering specs didn't meet my standards, the project didn't move forward. For years, I had helped Julian navigate these requirements, offering advice and streamlining his submissions because I considered him a friend. That courtesy had officially expired. I opened Julian's preliminary proposal on my laptop. It was riddled with minor optimizations, shortcuts designed to increase profit margins at the expense of long-term durability. Normally, I would have sent him a private note to correct these. Instead, I drafted a formal memorandum to the City Council, highlighting every single optimization as a potential structural risk. I attached the data from a recent seismic study he had conveniently downplayed. It wasn't an act of sabotage. It was an act of extreme professional diligence. I was simply doing my job with a level of scrutiny he wasn't prepared for. Around noon, I received a notification from my bank. A large purchase had been attempted at a luxury department store in the city. The transaction was declined. 10 seconds later, my phone lit up with a call from Paige. I didn't answer. I simply watched the screen until it went dark. She was likely standing at a checkout counter, the embarrassment of a declined card burning through her carefully curated image. It was a small, focused lesson in the reality of her new economy. I spent the afternoon orchestrating the removal of my remaining assets from the house. I had hired a professional moving crew, and by 2 p.m. I was standing in the driveway of my own home, watching them carry out the heavy mahogany desk and the safe that held my legal documents. The locks had been changed earlier that morning, and 2 security guards stood at the edge of the property line. A white Mercedes screeched to a halt at the curb. Paige jumped out, followed closely by Marcus. Her face was a mask of calculated outrage, the kind she used when a client tried to negotiate a lower commission. "Trevor, what is this?" she shouted, gesturing toward the moving truck. "You can't just lock us out. This is my home." "Legally, it is a property held in a premarital trust, Paige," I said, standing on the porch, my hands in my pockets. "I am simply exercising my right to secure the premises. Your personal belongings have been packed into the storage containers on the left. You have 4 hours to have them moved." "You're a monster," Marcus growled, stepping toward me. He stopped when one of the security guards moved to intercept him. "You're going to pay for this. We have rights." "You have the right to return my commercial-grade generator and the surveying equipment you took from my garage last month," I replied. "If they aren't in the driveway by sunset, the police will be visiting your warehouse to retrieve them. As for rights, Marcus, you might want to check the status of your business credit line. Since it was secured against my personal assets and I've withdrawn my guarantee, the bank has likely issued a freeze." The color drained from Marcus's face. He turned to Paige, who was frantically typing on her phone. "Trevor, let's just talk," she said, her voice dropping the aggression and shifting into a soft, manipulative tone. "We can fix this. Leo didn't mean it. We were all just tired. Come inside, let's have a glass of wine and settle this like we used to." "There is no used to anymore, Paige," I said. "The structural integrity of this relationship was based on mutual respect. You traded that for a joke at a dinner table. Now the bill is due." I turned and walked into the house, closing the door behind me. I heard her screaming my name, her palms thumping against the wood, but the sound was muffled by the thick insulation I had installed myself. I walked through the empty rooms, the silence a welcome relief. I felt no nostalgia. I only felt the satisfaction of a clean sight. The rehook happened an hour later. I was in the kitchen, checking the security feed on my tablet, when I saw a car pull up behind Paige's Mercedes. It was Julian's car. He didn't get out immediately. He sat there for a moment, and I saw Paige walk over to his window. They spoke briefly, and Julian handed her a thick envelope. I zoomed in on the camera feed. The envelope was heavy, and as Paige took it, she looked around nervously. This wasn't just a friend helping a friend. This was an exchange. I cross-referenced the date with my professional calendar. Julian was supposed to submit his final bid for the Riverside project today. The envelope likely contained the consulting fees he had been skimming from his previous projects, fees that should have been reported as taxable income. I realized then that Paige wasn't just Julian's friend, she was his conduit. She had been using her real estate licenses to move money for his developments, masking the trail through commissions and consulting. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a coordinated effort to use my professional reputation as a cloak for their financial irregularities. I felt a surge of cold, analytical energy. This changed the nature of the project. This wasn't just scour anymore. This was a sinkhole. That evening, I decided to apply a bit of physical pressure. I knew Julian frequented a private cigar lounge on the south side of the city, a place where deals were made in the shadows of heavy leather chairs and expensive smoke. I arrived at 9 p.m., dressed in a sharp suit, looking every bit the successful engineer they thought I still was. I found Julian in the back corner, a glass of bourbon in his hand and a smug look on his face. He saw me and straightened up, his eyes darting toward the exit. "Trevor, didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice forced. "Look, about the email." "I'm not here about the email, Julian," I said, pulling up a chair and sitting directly across from him. I didn't wait for an invitation. I leaned forward, my elbows on the table, invading his personal space. "I saw the exchange this afternoon," I said, my voice a whisper that carried the weight of a sledgehammer. "I saw the envelope you gave Paige. I know about the consulting fees, Julian. I know how you've been moving the money." Julian's face went pale. He tried to take a sip of his drink, but his hand was shaking so badly the ice clinked against the glass. "You don't know what you're talking about. That was personal. She's going through a hard time because of you." "She's going through a hard time because she chose the wrong partner in crime," I said. "And you chose the wrong man to humiliate. You wanted me out of the Riverside project so you could push through your substandard bids without someone looking over your shoulder. But here's the problem. I'm not out. In fact, I've just been appointed as the lead auditor for the city's ethics committee regarding infrastructure spending." I was bluffing about the appointment, but Julian didn't know that. In his mind, I was the man with all the answers, the man who knew where every bolt was tightened and every dollar was spent. "What do you want?" he hissed, leaning in. "I want you to understand the weight of the structure you've built," I said. "Every time you laughed at me, every time you encouraged Leo to disrespect me, you were adding load to a beam that was already cracking. Now it's going to snap." I stood up, but I didn't leave. I walked around the table and stood behind him, my hand resting heavily on the back of his chair. "I'm going to be at the board meeting on Friday, Julian. I'm going to present my findings. And then I'm going to walk out of that room, and I'm never going to think about you again. But you? You're going to be thinking about me for the next decade." I leaned down, my mouth close to his ear. "Don't try to move the money tonight. I've already alerted the bank to suspicious activity on the joint accounts Paige was using. If you touch those funds, you're not just breaking a contract. You're inviting a federal investigation." I walked out of the lounge without looking back. I could feel his eyes on my back, full of fear and a sudden, desperate realization of his own fragility. The night wasn't over. I had one more stop to make. I drove to the local community college where Leo spent his evenings studying, which usually meant sitting in his friend's car in the parking lot, blasting music and acting like a king. I found him exactly where I expected. He was sitting in the passenger seat of a modified sedan, laughing with two other boys. When he saw my SUV pull in, his laughter died. He climbed out of the car, trying to look tough in front of his friends. "You again?" he spat. "What, did you come to take my shoes next?" I didn't say a word. I simply drove the SUV toward him, stopping just inches from his knees. The headlights were on high beam, blinding him. He shielded his eyes, stumbling back against his friend's car. I stepped out, leaving the engine running. The roar of the powerful motor filled the quiet parking lot. I walked up to him, the light from the headlamps casting my shadow over him like a shroud. "You like trucks, Leo?" I asked. "You like the power of a $60,000 machine?" "Get away from me," he stammered, his bravado completely gone. "I have the truck in a warehouse," I said. "Tomorrow it's being sold. The proceeds are going to a charity that teaches underprivileged kids how to actually build things they respect. As for you, I've spoken to the registrar. Since I'm no longer paying your tuition, you have 48 hours to settle the balance, or you'll be dropped from your classes." "You can't do that?" "I already did," I said. I reached out and tapped him on the chest, a small physical reminder of the gap between us. "Respect isn't purchased, Leo. It's earned, and you've just gone bankrupt." I climbed back into my SUV and backed away, leaving him standing in the dark, a small, insignificant figure in a world that no longer owed him a thing. As I drove back to the hotel, I felt a sense of immense calm. The pieces were moving exactly as I had planned. The isolation was nearly complete. Paige was desperate, Marcus was broke, and Julian was terrified. They had thought I was a bridge they could walk over. They were about to find out what happens when the bridge decides to pull itself apart. The atmosphere in the city had turned humid, a heavy pressure building in the air that mirrored the tension I was systematically applying to the lives of those who had betrayed me. In engineering, there is a phenomenon known as creep the tendency of a solid material to move slowly or deform permanently under the influence of persistent mechanical stresses. It is a quiet, invisible process until the moment the material simply ceases to hold. I was watching the creep set into Paige's social and professional circles, and I was the one maintaining the load. I spent Wednesday morning in a quiet corner of the city's records office. While my attorney handled the overt legal maneuvers, I preferred the manual labor of research. I began pulling old property transfers linked to Paige from before we met. I was looking for a pattern. If she was using Julian now, it was highly probable she had used someone else before. As I scrolled through microfiche and digital archives, I found a series of transactions from 5 years ago. They involved a developer who had suddenly retired from the industry following a massive audit. The name on the secondary listing agent line was Paige's maiden name. The pattern was identical: a stable man with a solid reputation, a series of complex land acquisitions, and a sudden quiet exit where the man lost everything while Paige walked away with a clean record and a significant consulting bonus. I wasn't just her husband, I was her latest project. I was the bridge she intended to cross before burning it for the insurance money. The realization brought a strange sense of peace. It confirmed that my response wasn't just about a bruised ego from a dinner toast. It was a necessary defensive maneuver against a professional predator. By 2 p.m., I was parked outside a mid-range bistro where Paige was meeting 2 of her most influential clients, a couple looking to sell a multi-million-dollar estate. They were exactly the kind of people who valued stability and discretion above all else. I waited until I saw them seated through the window, their menus open, Paige leaning forward with that practiced, captivating smile that I once thought was reserved for me. I stepped out of my car and walked into the restaurant. I didn't rush. I moved with the deliberate pace of a man who owned the floor he walked on. As I approached the table, Paige's smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated. Her eyes went wide and her hand instinctively moved to cover the listing contract on the table. "Trevor," she hissed, her voice a strained whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I apologize for the interruption," I said, ignoring her and addressing the couple. I recognized the husband, a retired judge named Miller. "Judge Miller, Mrs. Miller, it's a pleasure to see you again. I believe we last spoke at the gala for the Children's Hospital." "Ah, Trevor Vance," the judge said, standing to shake my hand. "Good to see you. We were just discussing the listing with your lovely wife." "Actually," I said, my voice steady and resonant enough for the neighboring tables to hear, "that's why I'm here. As the primary stakeholder in our joint business filings, I'm required to inform you that our firm is currently undergoing a mandatory internal audit. Until the financial discrepancies regarding certain consulting fees are resolved, all new listings are being placed on an administrative hold." The silence at the table was absolute. The judge's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Mrs. Miller slowly set her wineglass down, her expression shifting from curiosity to suspicion. "Discrepancies?" the judge asked. "Trevor is joking," Paige said, her voice rising an octave. She laughed, a brittle, terrifying sound. "He's such a prankster. We're just having a little domestic spat, Judge. It's nothing professional." "I assure you, Judge, I am not in the habit of joking about fiduciary duty," I said. I pulled a small, professionally printed card from my pocket, the contact information for the ethics auditor I had briefed that morning. "If you have questions regarding the integrity of the transaction, please contact this office. I value your reputation too much to let it be associated with an unstable portfolio." I nodded to the couple, ignored the look of pure, unadulterated loathing on Paige's face, and walked out. I didn't need to stay to hear the fallout. I knew the Millers. They would be out of that restaurant within 10 minutes, and by sunset, every high-end seller in the district would hear that Paige was under audit. In real estate, the perception of impropriety is just as final as the reality of it. I was halfway to my car when I heard the clicking of heels on the pavement. "You think you're so smart," Paige screamed. She didn't care who saw her now. The mask was off. "You're ruining me. I worked for years to build that network." "You used my name to build it," I said, turning to face her. "You used my credit to fund it, and you used my trust to hide your dealings with Julian. I'm not ruining you, Paige. I'm simply withdrawing the support beams. If the house you built was made of cards, that's an architectural flaw, not my responsibility." "I'll take you for everything," she vowed, her face contorted. "I'll tell everyone you're abusive. I'll tell them you snapped." "You can tell them whatever you like," I said, "but I have the security footage from the dinner, I have the recordings of Marcus threatening me in the parking lot, and I have the files from 5 years ago, Paige. I know about the developer in the Heights. I know how this ends for you." She stopped mid-stride. The mention of the previous developer hit her like a physical blow. The color left her face, leaving her looking older, tired, and desperate. She realized then that I wasn't playing a game of emotions. I was conducting a forensic investigation into her entire life. I left her standing on the sidewalk and drove toward the north side of town. It was time to deal with Leo again. The boy was the weak link, the loudest, most entitled, and therefore the most easily broken. I found him at a local park, sitting on a bench with a girl I didn't recognize. He was trying to act cool, but he looked disheveled. His clothes were wrinkled, and he was clutching a cheap energy drink like it was a lifeline. He saw my SUV and immediately stood up, his face reddening. "Go away," he shouted. "I'm calling the cops." "On what grounds, Leo?" I asked, stepping out. "I'm in a public park. I'm just here for a walk." I walked over to the bench. The girl looked at me, then at Leo, sensing the shift in power. "I heard you tried to use your mother's emergency card at the electronics store this morning," I said. "It's a shame. That card was linked to a business line that I closed at noon. I believe the store manager kept the card. That's going to be a difficult conversation for her to have with her bank." "You're a freak," Leo said, his voice cracking. "Why are you doing this? It was just one toast. It was a joke." "It wasn't the toast, Leo," I said, sitting on the end of the bench. I looked at the girl. "You should probably know that your boyfriend here is currently facing an administrative withdrawal from his college because he hasn't paid his tuition. He also doesn't have a car, and as of tomorrow, he won't have a place to live." "Shut up!" Leo lunged at me, a clumsy telegraphed swing. I didn't even have to move much. I simply stood up and caught his forearm, redirecting his momentum. He stumbled and fell into the grass. I didn't hit him. I didn't need to. The humiliation of falling in front of his girlfriend was far more damaging than a slap. I stood over him, looking down. "That's the second time you've tried to exert power you don't have. Don't let there be a third. You aren't a man, Leo. You're a passenger, and your ride has officially reached the end of the line." I walked back to my car, the girl already standing up and walking away from him. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. It was a small, physical manifestation of the larger collapse. As I drove back toward the center of the city, my phone buzzed with an alert from my home security system. Someone was at the house. I pulled up the feed on my dashboard screen. It was Marcus. He was at the side gate, trying to pry it open with a crowbar. He looked frantic, his movements jagged and desperate. I didn't call the police? Not yet. I wanted him to get inside the perimeter. I had installed a very specific set of high-intensity, motion-activated floodlights and a sonic deterrent system designed for large industrial sites. I watched as he finally forced the gate. The moment his foot hit the gravel of the inner courtyard, the night vanished. 4 10,000-lumen LED arrays ignited simultaneously, bathing the yard in a blinding, artificial noon. At the same time, the sonic emitters began to pulse, a high-frequency, non-lethal pitch designed to cause immediate disorientation and nausea. On the screen, I saw Marcus drop the crowbar and clutch his ears. He fell to his knees, his mouth open in a silent scream. He scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet, desperate to get away from the light and the sound. He didn't stop until he was back on the sidewalk, gasping for air, his hands shaking. I pulled over to the side of the road and dialed his number. He answered on the first ring, his voice a panicked sob. "What? What was that?" he gasped. "That was a warning, Marcus," I said, my voice as cold as the hotel room air. "You are currently trespassing on a secured site. The system is automated, but the next stage involves a direct notification to the authorities with high-definition footage of your face. If you ever come near that property again, I won't turn the sound off." "Trevor, please," he moaned. "I have bills. The bank froze everything. I just needed the equipment so I could finish a job. I'm going to lose my contract." "You already lost it," I said. "I spoke to the developer this afternoon. I told him the truth about your equipment's maintenance records. He's already looking for a new subcontractor. You're done, Marcus. Go home." I hung up. The pressure was reaching its peak. The isolation was complete. They were no longer a family or a team. They were 3 desperate individuals, each trying to stay afloat as the ground I had provided for them vanished. But as I sat there, a final notification appeared on my laptop. It was an encrypted message from an old contact in the municipal planning office. "Trevor, you need to see this. Julian just filed an emergency amendment to the Riverside bid. He's trying to fast-track the approval tonight, bypassing the ethics committee. He's using a signature that looks remarkably like yours." I felt a tightening in my chest, not of fear, but of anticipation. He was trying to forge my technical approval to save his deal. It was a move of pure desperation, and it was exactly the opening I needed for the final reckoning. The real audience wasn't the dinner table. It wasn't even the city council. The real audience was the law of physics. And I was about to show them exactly what happens when you try to forge a foundation. The final alignment began not with a roar, but with the quiet hum of a high-speed scanner. I sat in my hotel room, watching the digital rendering of Julian's forged signature materialize on my screen. It was a proficient imitation, the way the T in Trevor slanted slightly to the left, the specific loop of the V, but to an engineer who spent his life analyzing minute structural tolerances, it was a glaring anomaly. Julian was desperate. Desperation is a poor architect. It prioritizes speed over integrity, and that is where every flawed system eventually fails. By Thursday morning, the convergence was accelerating. I had spent the night mapping the flow of Julian's emergency amendment. He wasn't just trying to bypass the ethics committee. He was trying to secure a massive mobilization payment before the audit could be finalized. He needed that capital to pay off the debts Paige had helped him shuffle through various shell companies. If the city released those funds, Julian and Paige would have the liquidity to vanish, or at least litigate their way into a stalemate. I had to ensure the valve remained closed. I reached out to the city's chief procurement officer, a woman named Sarah, who valued the city's treasury like it was her own. I didn't send an angry email. I sent a technical brief. I detailed the discrepancies in the Riverside bid, focusing on the forged approval. I didn't mention the personal betrayal. In the world of municipal contracts, a personal grudge is a distraction. A forged signature is a felony. "Trevor," Sarah said when she called me 10 minutes later. Her voice was taut. "If what you're saying is true, Julian is attempting to defraud the city on a massive scale. But he claims you gave him verbal approval during a private dinner last week." "I was at a dinner last week, Sarah," I replied, leaning back in my chair and looking at the photo I'd taken of Julian and Paige at the restaurant. "But it wasn't a business meeting, and I certainly didn't approve a bid that reduces the reinforcement steel in the primary supports by 15%. Check the metadata on the digital signature. It was applied from an IP address linked to his private residence at 2:00 a.m. yesterday. I was checked into a hotel at that time." The silence on the other end was the sound of Julian's future collapsing. "I'm pausing the payment," she said, "and I'm calling a special session of the oversight board for tomorrow morning. You need to be there." "I'll be there," I said, "and I'll bring the original blueprints." With the professional trap set, I turned my attention back to the domestic front. The isolation was nearly complete, but the twist I had discovered regarding Paige's past required one final confirmation. I drove to the office of the developer she had worked with 5 years ago, a man named Elias who had been forced into early retirement. He lived in a modest house now, a far cry from the mansions he used to build. Elias was hesitant to speak until I showed him the photo of Paige and Julian. He looked at the image, a weary recognition settling over his features. "She's a fixer, Trevor," Elias said, his voice raspy. "She doesn't just sell houses. She finds men in positions of power who have one foot off the ledge, and she offers to be the bridge. She handles the money, she manages the optics, and when the wind shifts, she's the first one to jump. I thought she loved me. By the time I realized she was funneling my overhead into her own accounts, the city was already at my door. She didn't just leave, she provided the evidence that cleared her and buried me." "And Julian?" I asked. "Julian was my junior partner back then," Elias said, a grim smile touching his lips. "He was the one who introduced us. They've been a team for a long time, Trevor. You weren't just a husband, you were a 5-year plan." The revelation was the final piece of the structural analysis. The disrespect at the dinner hadn't been an accident or a lapse in judgment by a spoiled teenager. It had been the planned exit strategy. They wanted me to react, to blow up, to become the unstable element that would allow Paige to file for a lucrative separation while Julian took over my professional territory. Leo's toast was meant to be the spark. They just hadn't expected me to be fireproof. I thanked Elias and left. The calculated nature of the betrayal was breathtaking in its scope, but it gave me a distinct advantage. They were playing a game of emotional manipulation and financial shell games. I was playing a game of load-bearing reality. I spent the afternoon orchestrating a high-tension public confrontation. I knew Paige and Julian were meeting with Marcus at his warehouse to discuss how to handle the Trevor problem. They thought they were in a safe, private space. They were wrong. I had the keys to that warehouse. The lease was still in my name, a detail Marcus had overlooked in his rush to use my credit. I arrived at 5 Samuwak p.m. I didn't sneak in. I parked my SUV right in front of the bay doors, blocking them in. I walked through the side entrance, my boots echoing on the concrete floor. The 3 of them were huddled around a folding table in the center of the dusty space. Blueprints were spread out, along with several ledgers. When they saw me, the air in the room seemed to vanish. "Trevor," Marcus barked, reaching for a heavy wrench on the table. "You've got a lot of nerve coming here after what you did to my yard." "Put the wrench down, Marcus," I said, my voice flat and cold. "You've already failed at trespassing. Don't add assault to your resume. You can't afford the legal fees." Paige stood up, her face a mask of desperation. "Trevor, stop this. We can still work something out. Julian and I, we were just trying to protect the business." "Which business, Paige?" I asked, walking toward them. "The one where you move Julian's skimmed commissions, or the one where you find a new husband every 5 years to keep your lifestyle afloat? I talked to Elias today." The name hit her like a physical weight. She sank back into her chair, her eyes darting to Julian. Julian, for his part, tried to maintain his composure. He smoothed his expensive suit jacket and stepped forward. "Elias was a failure, Trevor. He made mistakes. We're just trying to survive in a tough market. You're the one who turned this into a war. You could have just stayed in your lane." "My lane is the one that ensures things don't fall apart, Julian," I said, "and you've been tampering with the supports. I've already spoken to Sarah at procurement. The Riverside payment is frozen. The forgery investigation starts at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." Julian's bravado vanished. He looked at the ledgers on the table, then back at me. "You're destroying yourself too, you know. If the project fails, your firm takes the hit." "My firm is insured for professional liability," I said, "and I've already submitted my resignation to the board, effective after my testimony. I'm moving on, Julian, but you're staying right here in the ruins." Marcus stepped forward, his face red. "I don't care about your projects. You ruined my credit. I can't even buy fuel for the trucks." "That's because you were using my fuel, Marcus," I said. I looked at the three of them, the wife who was a predator, the friend who was a thief, and the brother-in-law who was a parasite. The dinner was supposed to be my humiliation. You all sat there and laughed while Leo called me a fake dad. You thought I was too weak or too invested to do anything about it. "It was a joke," Leo shouted, appearing from the small office in the back. He looked disheveled, his eyes red. "Why can't you just take a joke?" I turned to him. "Because, Leo, in the real world, things have weight. And when you pull the pin on a grenade, you don't get to complain about the noise. You wanted to know what respect looked like? This is it. It's the ability to dismantle everything you think you own with a few phone calls and a firm understanding of the law." I walked to the table and picked up one of the ledgers. Julian reached for it, but I pushed his hand away with a firm, immovable grip. "This stays with me," I said. "It's going to the audit committee, along with the photos of you two together, and the records of the transfers Paige made from our joint account to your shell company." "You can't do this," Paige whispered, her voice breaking. "I have nothing else." "You have exactly what you brought into this marriage, Paige," I said, which, as it turns out, was a trail of broken men and fraudulent listings. You should have picked a partner who didn't know how to read the fine print. I turned and walked toward the exit. "Trevor," Julian yelled, "we can settle this. I'll give you a cut of the next project. Just don't go to the board." I stopped at the door and looked back over my shoulder. The lighting in the warehouse was dim, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. They looked small, 3 people huddling in a cold building, surrounded by the evidence of their own greed. "I'm not interested in a cut, Julian," I said. "I'm interested in the structural integrity of the city, and as of today, you've been condemned." I walked out and climbed into my SUV. As I pulled away, I saw them through the windows, arguing frantically, the unity they once had dissolving into a frantic scramble for self-preservation. They were turning on each other now, the way predators do when the prey escapes and the cage starts to shrink. I drove toward the center of the city, the lights of the skyline reflecting off my windshield. I felt a profound sense of lightness. The weight of the deception, the years of quiet disrespect, the burden of trying to sustain a foundation that was never there, it was all gone. I reached into my glove box and pulled out the final meeting notice for the next morning. It was the peak of the arc. Every betrayal, every hidden transaction, and every staged insult was about to be laid bare in a room where facts were the only currency that mattered. I thought about the truck. It had been sold that afternoon. The money was already being processed for the youth center. I thought about the house, now empty and silent, a monument to a life I no longer needed. The final confrontation was less than 12 hours away. I would be there early, I would be prepared, and I would ensure that when the final blow was struck, the collapse would be absolute. The boardroom of the Municipal Oversight Committee was a space designed for gravity. High ceilings, mahogany paneling, and a long, polished table that acted as a physical barrier between those who served the city and those who sought to profit from it. I arrived 30 minutes early. I wore a charcoal suit that had been tailored for precision, carrying a leather briefcase containing the finality of my research. I didn't feel the racing pulse of a man seeking a fight. I felt the steady, calm resolve of an inspector delivering a failed grade. By 9 a.m., the room began to fill. Sarah, the procurement officer, sat at the head of the table, her expression as neutral as a stone wall. To her left were 3 committee members, their tablets open and ready to record the proceedings. Julian arrived 5 minutes later. He looked like a man who had spent the night trying to outrun a storm. His eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, and his suit, though expensive, seemed to hang loosely on a frame that had lost its confidence. Behind him came Paige. She had tried to dress for the occasion, a conservative navy dress and pearls, but the way she gripped her handbag betrayed the tremors in her hands. They didn't look at me as they took their seats across the table. They looked at the empty air between us, as if hoping the distance could shield them from the documentation I was about to present. "This special session is called to order," Sarah began, her voice crisp and echoing in the silent room. "We are here to review a series of anomalies regarding the Riverside Development Project, specifically a late-hour amendment submitted by Julian Miller's firm, which carries the technical approval signature of our lead consultant, Trevor Vance. Trevor, you've requested this time to address the committee." I stood up. I didn't use a microphone. My voice carried through the quiet room with ease. "Thank you, Sarah. Members of the committee, as a licensed civil engineer, my primary obligation is to the safety and structural integrity of our public infrastructure. When I reviewed the amendment filed by Mr. Miller's firm, I found 3 significant issues that make the project untenable." I opened my briefcase and distributed a series of folders. First, the amendment proposes a 15% reduction in structural steel for the primary support columns. This brings the safety factor down to a level that I cannot and would never approve. Second, the digital signature on this document was not applied by me. I have provided the committee with a forensic digital report showing the signature was forged using a previous scan of my seal, applied at a time when I was verified to be elsewhere. I heard a sharp intake of breath from Paige. Julian stared at his hands, his knuckles turning white. "And third," I continued, "this amendment was filed as an emergency measure to trigger a mobilization payment of $4 million. My investigation into the firm's recent financial activity, which I was forced to conduct after discovering irregularities in my own household accounts, suggests that these funds were not intended for construction. They were intended to cover a series of private debts and offshore transfers managed by a third party." I placed a final document on the table. It was a copy of the ledger I had taken from the warehouse. This ledger, found in a facility leased under my name but used by Mr. Miller and my wife, Paige Vance, details the movement of capital over the last 6 months. It shows a clear pattern of diverting municipal resources into shell companies. The joke that started this process was not just a lack of respect. It was a distraction meant to keep me from looking at the books. Sarah looked at Julian. "Mr. Miller, do you have a response to these allegations?" Julian stood up, his voice cracking. "This is a personal vendetta. Trevor is going through a difficult separation. He's trying to destroy my reputation because he's angry. These files, he could have fabricated them himself." "The forensic report on the signature came from an independent third-party firm," I said, not looking at him. "The ledger contains Paige's own handwriting and timestamps that match the city's transaction records. Unless you are suggesting that I forced her to document her own financial activities, the evidence stands on its own." The committee members leaned in, whispering among themselves. The air in the room had shifted. It was no longer about a project. It was about a reckoning. "I have one more piece of evidence," I said. I pulled out my tablet and tapped the screen, projecting a series of messages onto the wall at the end of the room. They were the texts between Paige and Julian from the last month, the ones I had recovered from the cloud backup she had forgotten I had access to. "Julian? He's getting too close to the Riverside numbers. We need him out of the office. Paige, I'll handle it. Leo can push his buttons at dinner. If Trevor snaps, we can use it to file the injunction. He'll be too busy with the lawyers to check the filings." The room went cold. Not the metaphorical cold of an emotional state, but the literal, chilling silence of a truth fully exposed. Paige let out a small, choked sound. She didn't look like a predator anymore. She looked like a witness at her own sentencing. "The plan was simple," I told the committee. "Use a domestic crisis to create a professional vacuum. While I was distracted by the collapse of my marriage and the social fallout choreographed by Mr. Miller's associates, they would secure the mobilization funds and move them beyond the city's reach. The disrespect wasn't a personality flaw, it was a tactical maneuver." Sarah stood up, her face a mask of professional fury. "The committee has heard enough. The Riverside project is officially suspended pending a full criminal audit. Mr. Miller, your firm's license to bid on municipal contracts is revoked effective immediately. We will be turning these materials over to the district attorney's office within the hour." "Wait," Paige cried out, standing up. Her chair scraped harshly against the floor. "Trevor, you can't do this. We're a family. Think about Leo." I turned to her then. For the first time in days, I looked her directly in the eye. "I am thinking about Leo, Paige. I'm thinking about how he was taught that a man's worth is measured by how much you can take from him while laughing at his face. I'm thinking about how he helped you plan a public humiliation for the person who was feeding him. He's young enough to learn that actions have consequences. This is his first lesson. I closed my briefcase. As for us, the papers were served to your attorney 10 minutes ago. Since the house and the majority of the assets were held in my premarital trust, and I have documented the theft from our joint accounts, you will find your remaining belongings at the storage facility I mentioned. The locks have been finalized. The credit lines are gone. The bridge is down. I walked toward the door. I didn't wait for the committee to dismiss me. I didn't wait for Julian's pleas or Paige's tears. I had delivered the report. The structure had failed, and I was the inspector walking away from the ruins. As I reached the hallway, I saw Marcus and Leo standing by the elevators. They had clearly been waiting for the news. Marcus looked like he wanted to charge me, but the presence of the 2 security guards I had hired to wait in the hall made him think twice. He was a man who only fought when the odds were in his favor, and today he was outnumbered by the truth. Leo looked at me, and for the first time I saw no mockery in his eyes. I saw fear. He was realizing that the world he had occupied, the one where he could insult the provider and still expect the gift, was a fantasy. "Where are we supposed to go?" Leo asked, his voice small. "That's a logistics problem, Leo," I said as the elevator doors opened. "And I'm no longer your engineer." I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors began to close, I saw Julian and Paige emerge from the boardroom, pursued by the committee's legal counsel. They were shouting at each other now, the alliance of greed finally succumbing to the pressure of self-preservation. Paige was pointing a finger at Julian's chest, and Julian was backing away, his face twisted in a snarl. The doors shut with a soft, mechanical click. In the lobby, the morning sun was bright, reflecting off the glass and steel of the city I had helped build. I walked out onto the sidewalk and felt the air, clear, sharp, and free of the scent of rosemary and arrogance. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my car keys. I didn't go to the house. I didn't go to the office. I drove toward the highway, toward the open road that led out of the city. I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. I saw the municipal building receding in the distance. I saw the skyline I had contributed to, a grid of logic and physics that would remain long after the people inside it had been forgotten. I reached over and turned off my phone. The screen went dark, a final black mirror that reflected nothing but the road ahead. I had spent my life ensuring that things held together, that the weight was distributed, and the foundations were deep. But sometimes, the most important thing an engineer can do is recognize when a structure is beyond saving. I pressed the accelerator. The engine hummed, a perfect, synchronized harmony of thousands of moving parts working in total alignment. I wasn't looking for a new project. I wasn't looking for a new family. I was just driving. Behind me, the collapse was total. The reputation of the real estate agent was a memory. The career of the developer was a scandal. The entitlement of the son was a lesson. And the man who had been the fake dad was simply a man again, moving at his own speed, under his own power, across a landscape that owed him nothing. I reached the city limits and kept going. The road was smooth, the horizon was clear, and for the first time in years, the load was zero.